Hey, what is going on, everyone? It's me, Mr. Mario, and welcome back to another episode of ModChat. For those who do not know, this here is a podcast I do here in two different forms. First of all, it is available in a video visual form here on the Mr. Mario 2011 YouTube, Rumble, and Odyssey channels. And secondly, it is available in a audio only form. Simply look up ModChat, all one word, on your favorite podcasting app, host, provider, or platform, and you should hopefully be able to find it. I know it's not available on all of them, but it is available on most of them. Either way, this here is a podcast where I come on here at least monthly, share some things that I find cool, interesting, maybe some show and tell, just things that I want to talk about in general in the world of video game modding and video game console modding. I think usually we have some fun here, and it's not necessarily a news show, but if you want to use this as your source for news, by means, do go ahead and do it as long as you are entertained. Either way here, we're going to go ahead and get into some of the topics because we have some, I guess, hyper news that we can get to. You'll see what I'm talking about with not just one, but two systems here. I'm a little excited. The first piece of news here we're going to be talking about is mostly going to be sourced from Wololo, and of course, like any other topic I cover, the links will be down below in the description on the video upload of this. However, here we're going to be talking about the PS5 getting its Hypervisor defeated, which is probably what most people are most excited for. Now, this was covered about a month ago here, and don't worry, I'm going to have some additional things in here because we have some more news on this, but they state here from Wololo that SpectreDev has defeated the Hypervisor, and you can see a little bit of the sample right here. They state here, PlayStation hacker SpectreDev has taken to Twitter today to hint that he has managed to hack the PS5 Hypervisor with at least the help of ChindoChap. Although it's unclear if the hack will be released at this point, SpectreDev gave the precision that this is for firmwares 1.x and 2.x, and that firmware 3.00 patches the vulnerabilities that have been used here. Now, if anybody is wondering why this is, I guess they say, the holy grail of modifying or hacking up the PS5, they answer by saying it's been known for a while that the PS5 is way more secure than the PS4 when it comes to hacking attempts. In particular, the PS5 runs with a hypervisor, which controls and limits what all processes can do, including the kernel itself. Case in point, although the console has been jailbroken on low firmwares for quite some time, arbitrary read-write to the firmwares have still eluded the scene. Most kernel hacks currently rely on Slayer-Govy's K-Stuff, which bypasses some of these limitations by patching registers at execution time instead of patching the kernel in RAM. Controlling the hypervisor could finally give the read-write access to the kernel and allow for deeper modifications of the console firmware at runtime, like a HIN does on the PS4 or PS3. So for anybody who is wondering, well, we can already jailbreak and modify the PS5, why is this different? That's it right there, if you're wanting to get something a little more fleshed out. Now, they do state that breaking the hypervisor in itself isn't the end of the story, though. Ahead of the news, Zekoshao has attempted to calm everyone's expectations with the following message. Some heads up about PS5 package installation and hypervisor being defeated. Defeating the hypervisor won't automatically make you be able to install PS5 packages, even if you have access to kernel.txt read and write. You can, however, use the added power to try and defeat the A53IO core processor that separately handles the PS5 packages, but nobody has tried that yet. Which this is a trend that I see pretty common on the PS5, which is smart. Security-wise, it makes sense. As opposed to, well, not only more security on here, they have a hypervisor on the PS5, but on top of that, there's physically many different little components and chips and chipsets on the PS5 that control different parts of the security. So you can't just, say, hey, I'm going to hack the PS5 and that's the end of it. No, there's going to be a lot of little tiny things you need to do. So just like we've kind of covered a little bit, up until this point, the PS5 has been jailbroken, but we didn't have a way to defeat the hypervisor. Now that there is a way to exploit the hypervisor itself and really do what we need to on there, get that read-write access to the kernel, that's still not going to be the end. It's not just simply going to be development, it's going to be a lot more reverse engineering to get exactly what people are wanting to on here. So to be clear, if people are thinking this is going to automatically turn their PS5 experience into like a full experience that you get on like a PS3 with custom firmware, we're not going to see anything like that for a long while still, and maybe not ever to the point that we understand it. This was something real quick that I even covered years ago when talking about the PS4 and such, where essentially developers were saying that the way the PS4 is modified is not going to be the same as the PS3, where you will probably never be able to just take an installable pup file, like have a modified firmware, put it on a USB drive, and then install it onto the PS4. That's probably not going to be a thing. So the way we modify these systems has changed in recent generations, and that is simply because of, well, a lot more security on them, such as what was explained here. They are stating in the last bit that the Hypervisor will be harder to access on firmwares 3.0 and above, because they state that Sony entirely re-architected the Hypervisor, and this patched the method that was used to access it in firmware 2.x in the first place. SpectreDev had already explained that in earlier firmwares, that the Hypervisor was actually part of the kernel. According to the hacker, Sony probably knew, or at least suspected, what we did was a possibility, which is why they re-architected the whole thing. Multiple hackers have allegedly been able to hack the Hypervisor, including Flats and now SpectreDev. It is also believed that Fail Overflow have a Hypervisor exploit. So this is all cool to see here, and I do want to do a little bit of a firmware check just to show you all, if you have a jailbreakable PS5, how old it has to be really in terms of getting this to work if you're wanting to make use of the Hypervisor exploit. So I'm over on a great website here, which is the PS5 Dev Wiki, and I have referenced this before. I'm on the page 4 official firmware, and let's look at this here. So the firmware strings, as I've covered in many episodes like this, are different on the PS5 compared to the previous consoles. We have these long firmware strings right here, and this is typically what we would see on like development firmwares, so I always found it interesting they pushed it into production as well too. But you could see the short version here, which the short version is normally just what is after the first hyphen. So for example, this long firmware right here would be referred to as firmware 1.00. So if we look here, for example, since it was patched on 3, here we go. This one was released on April 14th, 2021. And I can tell you, at least myself here, I didn't even have a PS5 at that time. It took me a few months longer to end up getting my first PS5, but really this here is saying that you are going to have to find a PS5 or have a PS5 on hand that has not been updated on any firmware past, well, April 2021, let's say that. So let's say if miraculously you did have a PS5 and you bought it brand new in box and it was, on firmware 1.00 and you kept it there, you're good for this. Although, let's say you decided to buy one, use it, and you haven't used it for a while, or you took it offline. If you took it offline in, I don't know, let's say February 2021, then you should be good in this case. But here, remember how hard it was to find PS5. So really finding a PS5 on one of these low exploitable firmwares is going to be pretty darn difficult. However, for anybody who's yelling at me that I was covering something from about a month ago, well, it was a precursor to this here, in which we just got this recently, stating that SpectreDev presents Hypervisor Byepervisor exploit. They state here again on Wololo that PlayStation hacker SpectreDev has presented his Byepervisor PS5 exploit today at the Hardware I/O InfoSec conference. Although his slides and tools haven't been made public yet, and actually we're going to cover that here momentarily, we're already seeing a few early reports of the presentation. SpectreDev's Hypervisor exploit is working on PS5 firmwares up to 2.50, but it has recently been revealed that other hackers have Hypervisor vulnerabilities for higher firmwares, which is certainly good there. So that does, it shortens the timeline a little bit more on what I was saying earlier there. But I mean, if there's some things available for higher firmwares, I guess we'll see what's happening there, which based on the previous knowledge, just real quick, I am curious to see what happens, because technically, if someone has a Hypervisor exploit for firmware, let's say 3.00, that's an entirely different Hypervisor, so that's going to be interesting to see. They state here with the PS5 Hypervisor and the Byepervisor exploit that the PS5 Hypervisor is a piece of middleware designed to protect the console's firmware, notably its kernel, from malicious attacks. The Hypervisor in particular enforces execute-only memory rules on the kernel to avoid attackers from reading and writing critical parts of the system. SpectreDev presented a long-awaited explanation of how he managed to hack an early version of the PS5's Hypervisor. The PS5's Hypervisor has received several updates since the PS5 initially launched, but early versions were integrated with the kernel directly, which allowed hackers to look at it and eventually hack it. Real quick, just interjecting, this is exactly why, when it comes to people reverse engineering, they really look for and they try to keep those low firmware consoles, because you can have things like this where, although it's still difficult, it's certainly going to be easier to try and hack up the Hypervisor on such a low firmware as opposed to the latest firmware. Continuing on, newer revisions are more secure, and SpectreDev's exploit in particular cannot be leveraged on versions of the hypervisor that have been moved outside of the PS5 firmware kernel. Now, the big thing here is that hacking the hypervisor would allow the community to deactivate XOM, so execute only memory, and ultimately gives us read-write access to the PS5 kernel. Currently, arbitrary read-write isn't possible on the PS5 kernel, even on a jailbroken PS5. We bypass these limitations thanks to Slirsgovy's KStuff, a runtime debugger that modifies registers in real time, which we have covered before. Now, this was written before Byepervisor was officially published, but they do state here that Byepervisor in itself, despite being a huge breakthrough for PS5 hacking, will not be directly helpful to end users. Technically, we already have what's required via the existing jailbreak and Slirsgovy's KStuff, so it will take a while for Byepervisor to be integrated into existing tools and lead to more stuff. But in the short time, I'm assuming we'll see significant performance improvement in everything related to PS5 hacking, since running a debugger real-time isn't the best way to hack your console performance-wise. Deactivating execute-only memory on the PS5 will also let us finally see what the PS5 kernel contains, so I assume we'll see decrypted dumps of the firmware and decompilation efforts start soon, which ultimately will most likely lead to improvements to PS5 HIN, plugins, and the like. So here's to hoping, at least, even with the few people that do have these pieces of hardware, like the old revisions that do allow for Byepervisor to work on here, that even if you have a jailbroken PS5 on a higher firmware, you'll be able to reap some of the benefits from there. Now, the cool thing is Byepervisor has been published into its own GitHub repository from contributors Spectre and friend of the show here, Kiwi Dog or Kiwi Puppy or Kiwi Doggy here. They do state here that this Hypervisor exploit is for less than or equal to 2.x firmwares, and they do state, this is the part I didn't really cover before, but in terms of the nitty-gritty here, that two vulnerabilities and exploit chains are contained in the repo. They are independent of each other and either can be used. One exploit is provided mainly just for preservation, the old jump table exploit, and only the primary exploit chain needs to be used, which the QA flag exploit, and that's interesting here. I wasn't expecting that. Now, since the QA flag exploit will probably be the one that people will be using here, they state in regards to covering that, the primary and recommended exploit takes advantage of the fact that system quality assurance flags are shared between the hypervisor and the guest kernel. When the hypervisor initializes, the init code for constructing nested page tables will check QA flags for the system level debugging flag. If this flag is set, the nested page table entries will not have the XO text bit set for kernel.txt pages. And further, the kernel.txt pages will also have the right bit set. These flags are not reinitialized by the secure loader upon resume from sleep mode, though the hypervisor is. By setting the system level flag, putting the system to sleep, and resuming, we can edit the guest kernel's page tables to make kernel.txt pages read writable, allowing dumping of the kernel and hooks patches. So a really impressive way and really ingenious way, honestly, of taking advantage of that here. This currently includes kernel dumping code, the code to decrypt system library selfs over TCP, and a homebrew enabler for firmware 2.50. But in terms of how to use it, they state that you need to run the UMTX exploit chain in WebKit or BDJ and run an elf loader. So you of course need your entry point. I feel like this is a little scary for people who have battled with jailbroken PS4s and rest mode, but on this one you send the Byepervisor elf file and then you have to put the system into rest mode yourself. Once it's in rest mode, you then power it back on, and then you're able to send byepervisor.elf again. So that goes into what was covered here, where they're stating what's going on with setting that QA flag, being able to put the system in rest mode, and then when it comes out, that these flags are not reinitialized by the secure loader upon resume from sleep mode. So sleep mode, the thing that we have been battling for a while in terms of stability and usability there, ended up coming through here really well in terms of a hypervisor exploit. I don't know who would have predicted that. This stuff is ingenious at times. Now, we're not going to go through all of this here, but there is also a PDF available in the same repository that breaks down everything here. This is not a video, of course, but this here is just a PDF of these slides that he put up, and you could see, a little bit about SpectreDev, for example, here, and then covering really, well, how we broke the PS5 hypervisor. He does talk a little bit about the workarounds here, for example, where firmwares 3 to 4.x have public kernel exploits, but the hypervisor is stronger on higher firmwares, which we've talked about. Tricks that were discovered over time: the hypervisor cannot intercept everything, and the kernel needs some autonomy. but it doesn't result in a full hypervisor break, although it is still useful. And in terms of what we're actually able to do right now, at least, we are able to run PS4 homebrew on the PS5, and there's some limited debugging and introspection that you can do on here, but the limitations they state are that it can massively slow down system performance, it requires brute forcing gadgets, and it still doesn't defeat the execute-only memory to allow kernel reversing. And we did talk about the UMTX briefly, the UMTX exploit, which is the user mutex's exploit, and it shows that this works all the way from the original firmware up to 7.x firmwares, which is nice. I did cover a little bit about that before in a previous episode, but they state here that the exploit code by fail overflow and flats allowed rapid exploitation of the bug, and the cool thing is without them, he wouldn't have been able to do this talk. But it does open up lower firmwares to test theoretical bugs that they had and stumble on a new one that is a particularly big fail, which is the one we talked about with rest mode. Just a little bit of a spoiler alert there. Now, really after the demo and going to the end here, I had talked about already within these slides here and within the previous coverage here what we can do right now with a jailbroken PS5. But in terms of what's able to be done here, Flats is stating that we have the ability to read and write kernel.txt pages to give a lot of opportunities. We can rely on built-in kernel API to do things and reverse how devices work. We can patch and hook them to gain introspection. Debug future kernel exploits is considerably easier. We can end up in a similar situation with the PS4 was in after a kernel exploit, so something like the 9.0, 5.05, 11.0 jailbreaks, we could hopefully get to something like that, and booting Linux should now be possible with a lot of work. But the conclusions here are that the 1 and 2x hypervisor is a flimsy implementation. When the hypervisor is integrated so tightly with guest kernel, separation is basically impossible, and that Sony realized this, so starting in firmware 3, the hypervisor was loaded in a separate region independent of the kernel, and thus these exploits do not work. Breaking the hypervisor on a higher firmware is more challenging, but it has been done. And while the 2.x firmware is fairly old at this point, it's again over 3 years old now, these exploits still allow public research into the system previously not possible, and this can be used to find bugs in the coprocessor, which is pretty big there. And before getting to the end here, the shouts and greets, they have Chindo Chat for the ROP chain help and the meme bug, Flats for kernel dumps and other knowledge, fail overflow for the UMTX kernel exploit reference implementation, KiwiDog, Timstar, and Hardpone for help with demo stuff, and of course hardware.io for, allowing him to do this here. So overall, I think this is awesome to see and something that I didn't expect to see at least for even longer here. For anybody who might be wondering what they should do at this point, really if you're on one of those low firmware systems, I recommend keep it on a low firmware. If it's not going to be of use to you, get it into someone else's hands who it would be useful for. For people who are wanting a jailbreakable PS5 and are wanting, a low firmware PS5 like this, honestly, this probably wouldn't be helpful unless you are a reverse engineer. But if you're going to just be getting it to play game backups and such and mess around with homebrew, that's going to be a severe underutilization of a low firmware PS5 like this. However, the big thing, like I mentioned at the bottom here, which I am excited for and I feel like everyone else should be, is exactly what Wololo was saying here at the end here, saying that deactivating execute-only memory on the PS5 will also let us finally see what the PS5 kernel contains. So I assume we'll see decrypted dumps of the firmware and decompilation efforts start soon, which ultimately will most likely lead to improvements to PS5 HIN, plugins, and the like. That is what we can get the most excited for as end users. Riding high off that news, we're actually going to another Wololo article, which unfortunately is not going to be as happy or as exciting here. But we had seen many Switch emulators come and go. I know there's been a few mobile ones that I had seen like news of or some announcements, and then I didn't really follow after that. But Yuzu was debatably the biggest emulator, and it was taken down with a lawsuit. However, this left the other emulator, Ryujinx, being the biggest one in town after that, and it was still developed. However, here earlier in the month, October 2nd, they state here that Ryujinx is also now gone, unfortunately. Talking about this ceasing development, they state here that Ryujinx was, along with Yuzu, one of the two impressively good Nintendo Switch emulators out there. Ryujinx did not only emulate the Nintendo console very well, it added quality of life features, impressive network and crossplay functionality, as well as terrific rendering improvements to Nintendo Switch games. Anyone playing on one of these two emulators will tell you that these actually elevate the Nintendo Switch gameplay. But if you're trying to access Ryujinx's official website or GitHub, you'll now see either a 404 or an empty page. In short, on the tool's official Discord, one of the developers of Ryujinx, I believe this would be Byepervisor, announced that the emulator has ceased development effective immediately. They had this to say: Yesterday, GDK-chan was contacted by Nintendo and offered an agreement to stop working on the project, remove the organization and all related assets he's in control of. While awaiting confirmation on whether he would take this agreement, the organization has been removed. So I think it's safe to say what the outcome is. Rather than leave you with only panic and speculation, I decided to write this short message to give some closure. These words are my own. I don't want to speak for anyone else here, so just remember that while reading. Thank you to everyone who has contributed code, documentation, or issue reports to the project. Thank you all for following us throughout the development. I was able to learn a lot of really neat things about games that I love, enjoy them with renewed qualities and in unique circumstances, and I'm sure you all have experiences that are similarly special. I'm extending my own massive thanks to our moderation team who have been here through some rough circumstances and always found ways to make light of it. In the end here, Wololo is in short sharing his thoughts on, he wants to appreciate Nintendo for great games they produce, but doing things like this really makes it difficult for him. That Nintendo likes to go after emulators because they say, emulators are going to enable piracy. They're only for piracy. That's what they're going to believe here. Nintendo believes that emulators are illegal. That is their belief, like point blank period. They believe that emulators, unless they're authorized by them, are illegal. End of story. That's what they believe. Again, not what I believe, but that's what they believe. He touched up a little bit on the Yuzu lawsuit here, and many people believed that that was more because of the large price tags there with their Patreon and maybe the emulator not being as clean, but it kind of just more goes to show that Nintendo just wants to take down any of these here. This is going to be my own interjection in this, but it actually shows right here. You can see that what was really pushed with the Yuzu lawsuit was people playing pirated copies of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom early. And I know that there were two bigger games that had leaked out recently. I think one of them is Mario and Luigi Brotherhood. Super Mario Party Jamboree also ended up leaking early. And you gotta realize too that we're kind of hitting the twilight, although it feels like we've been here for a while, we're kind of hitting like the twilight era, so to speak, of the Switch, where we're getting some of the last bigger games on there. We're getting some of the last impressive games and some of the most impressive games on the system. And the Switch 2 is right around the corner. So I do know that there were some people who were even thinking that if the security is going to be quite similar on how to compile games, how to run games and such on the Switch 2, then it would make sense that, probably, I can say right now it's October 2024. Within the next 12 months, I'm sure they're going to at least announce the Switch successor. And if it's similar enough to the original Switch, I can see why Nintendo is going after the original Switch emulators to kind of put a squash to that. And typically with console generations, I've seen a lot of this too. Normally when a system is nice and new and fresh and it's doing incredibly well, when you have projects like this come up, that's when there's going to be a lot of heat. And then we'll see maybe a second round of that, or if you're Nintendo, you're going to see, several waves, but you see another big round of that, like right as the system is kind of starting to go out, like it's still on high, but it still has new, big, impressive games that are coming out on it, and there's going to be a successor inevitably coming out very soon, or at least being announced. That's when you'll normally see kind of a second, like, huge round, so to speak. But with Nintendo, I'll also say that I've seen this coincide a lot with game leaks as well. Just like, as I said here, Yuzu with Tears of the Kingdom, most people playing it early were playing it on the Yuzu emulator, so since that was kind of the biggest target, so to speak, I can see what was happening there. Now, in terms of news, I'm going to be honest here, we're covering a second round of Hypervisor news, and this here is news I'll be honest, I never thought I was going to cover, ever. I never thought I would cover this here, so it brings me a lot of joy to be able to share this with you all, but this is from developer Grimdoomer here, where he stated on Twitter, "As of today, I have a fully working software-only hypervisor exploit for the latest Xbox 360 retail dashboard 17559. Should work on almost any software version though. Here's what you need to know. This is not the soft mod the community desires. It's mostly a proof of concept to show the exploit is possible. It will most likely never be robust enough to be considered a soft mod, and I don't think the soft mod people desire will ever exist. The exploit is a race condition memory corruption and is not 100% reliable, works around 50% of the time. It can take a long time to trigger, upwards of 30 minutes, and if it fails, the console will crash and need to be rebooted. There may be room for improvements, but I suspect this is as good as this exploit will get. I do plan to responsibly disclose this to Microsoft. I doubt they will patch it, but if they do, just don't update past 17559 and you'll be fine. I will release the exploit with a full write-up sometime around February, not definitive, and I will most likely present this work at some security conference next year as well. Until then, I have no plans on disclosing any further details, although we did get one little further detail here. This here is again from Grim Doomer, in which he states, here's a time-lapse video showing my 360 Hypervisor exploit triggering in about 18.5 minutes. This is a pretty average time for the exploit with about 40% success rate. People asked if it works on Winchester, and I don't think there's any reason it won't, but I don't have one to test it on. And for anybody wondering what the mention of the Winchester is, in short, the final motherboard version of the Xbox 360 is called Winchester, and to this day, there's no publicly available exploit that works to RGH or modify the system or run unsigned code on it. Technically, there are ways you could do it, like if you have a Winchester development kit that can play unsigned code, or I have seen it as well too, where you could essentially have a zero fuse, like an unburned CPU, and then you're able to burn it in a way where you're technically not modifying the system, but you are allowing it in a stock state to play unsigned code. Kind of in short, that's what that means, but that's really not accessible for the end user. And what I'm saying here is there's no way to just like rip open a Winchester, install a glitch chip on there, and get it to boot. So the Winchester, in my opinion, it's still pretty accurate to say it is the unhackable 360, the only one that's been unhacked. But if this is a software-only exploit on the latest kernel, some people have been saying, hey, you might want to pick up a Winchester, or if you already have a Winchester, do not update it. Take that thing offline so it'll be ready for this. So this is about a 2-minute video. I'm probably going to skip around a little bit, but let's go ahead and get this into full screen so we can see what's going on. Good Lord, Twitter compression, man. All right, so what we're seeing here is this is a Xbox 360 FAT. He is showing that the seal has, well, still been sealed on here, although do keep in mind this is easy to bypass, but I'm going to trust Grim on here. Also, another sign is you could see the tape for the DVD drive. It doesn't look like it's been tampered with, and it is all still in one piece. So usually I just rip that off, but he's putting this here. He puts a USB drive in. He turned on the console. It is very fast, so it's not me changing that, but he signs in. He's going to show the firmware version, which is 17559. You could see the kernel right there, which is the latest kernel as of the last few years. He's now going to go back, and the game he's going to be playing is Tony Hawk's American Wasteland. So that is going to be a hint that I will directly say here, at least, that he's showing us. If you don't have Tony Hawk's American Wasteland, you might want to get yourself a copy. I actually had this back in the day. I ended up rebuying a copy, so I'll be all ready to go. But what he's going to do is he's going to go to the Create a Park, Unsaved Park, and he's going to load up a park called Hack Xbox. So he's loading it, and load successful, and let's see what happens. He's going to play it. It's loading. There we go. 1, 2, 3 red light quadrants. It is frozen right here, and this is this is the time lapse. So we see 2 quadrants, and from what I've seen, I think some people were asking about this, and he was saying that he is the one who is manipulating this with his code, essentially. But this is also really important to really visually show where this is at the exploit stage. So you can see the red lights keep changing. We're almost there. We're 16 minutes in. And let's see what happens. So here we go, about 18.5 minutes in. All lights are now green. The screen has cut to black. And here we go. Check this out. I'm not going to be playing the audio, but we now have the Bad Apple demo playing. So it's safe to say here that, actually, I'm even looking. There's actually, I'm just noticing there's no hard drive physically attached to the console, and then this ends up cutting to Neon Cat there, so it's a bit of a remix, but I just noticed that there's no hard drive physically attached to the system. I'll back up a little bit, but it's showing to me that you just need a copy of Tony Hawk's American Wasteland, and you need a USB drive. Let's actually go back a little bit and see, because I am curious. If you look at this, the device shows as a USB storage device, which to me is interesting twofold. One, because Tony Hawk's American Wasteland is so old, I didn't even know this game was capable of loading from USB storage devices. So I guess that's kind of some nice backwards compatibility they put into the kernel and the dashboard itself for older games. Because when this game came out, it was not possible to use USB storage as Xbox 360 storage on the console. Secondly, you could also see the date here has been corrupted, which I'm sure is on purpose because there's a few too many digits right there. It looks like this is set to January 1st, but I think that's 15014 for the year itself, and then you have 9:02 p.m. So that might be a little bit of a hint for what's going on here with the save and such, which we have covered before. But overall, I mean, we saw this guy, we saw what he did with the lower firmwares on the Xbox 360, where he was able to just copy a file to a hard drive, load up this exploit save, and was then able to launch into unsigned code. But aside from like the time here, this is looking better, and I will actually touch up on that because he did answer it in a reply. It's actually the first one right here in which someone's asking, may I ask why it takes so long? Not complaining, I think this is really amazing, I just don't understand the technical aspects of what's going on under the hood. And he replied back saying, complicated race condition that needs to be won with additional requirements being met at the same time. And even here, friend of the show and legend Josh Davidson, aka Octo450, asked here, nice, but what's up with the ring of light? And he replied, the ring of light is indicating various states of the exploit depending on which quads are lit up and what color, orange versus green. So overall, I mean, you have it right here. I'm of course going to have these linked, but if you're kind of wanting to know what to prepare for this Xbox 360 exploit, if you're wanting to mess around with it, one, it says here that he doesn't believe this will ever be robust enough to be considered a soft mod, and even if we do get something of some kind, he doesn't think that this is going to be the soft mod that people desire. So for anybody saying, we're going to get a soft mod, no, just stop with that. But if you're wanting to mess around with this here, really make sure you have a console that is on dashboard 17559 or lower. If you're on a lower dashboard, I wouldn't even recommend updating your system. If you're on 17559, do not update any further. And if you're needing a game, it looks like it's going to be Tony Hawk's American Wasteland, which is going to be the exploitable title for this. I haven't seen any hints or any news of any other exploitable titles for the system, but this is truly exciting to see. And we have something else here in terms of the Xbox 360 that also got me pretty excited as well too, and I do want to actually do some more coverage of this here, but this is from another legend here, Eaton, in which he says, after many long nights of deep reverse engineering, I have now cracked the code on Phison S11 based SSDs. Soon, you'll be able to reflash these SSDs for retail Xbox 360 compatibility. More details in the coming weeks. And if you check this out right here, he is using this as an example with a Inland brand, so a really affordable but pretty reliable, like an Inland brand SSD. And he's also showing this here within his software. I'm not going to open these ones up directly because he actually has another page on his site which is going to go into more detail about this. Now, for anybody who might be asking questions about this, the importance, why it's needed, all that, don't worry, we're hopefully going to cover it, and whatever Eaton covers, I'm going to try to fill in the blanks, but he's pretty detailed on this. So he is the author of Fat Explorer right here, but on his page for SSD support information, he states here that a new Fat Explorer feature is in development to enable the flashing of certain solid-state drives that will make them work inside unmodified retail Xbox 360 consoles. SSDs have always worked in RGH JTAG consoles, but now they can also work in retail as well. The feature is not released yet, but the following information is being provided to help answer questions and will continually be updated. So in terms of compatible SSDs, he states that the SSD needs to be using the Phison S11 controller. So it is not the NAND storage, it's not the brand, it's not even the SSD itself, it is the controller itself that the SSD internally uses. There are likely many end-of-life and discontinued drives that use this chip, but here are some that you can buy brand new today. And he links to an Inland Professional one, a PNY CS900, a Silicon Power A55, and a Verbatim VI550. And these all vary. I think these are all about 500 gigabytes in size, and all these vary from like $30 to $37. They're all pretty affordable. Some important notes here is that different size versions of the SSD model can use different controllers. For example, the Kingston A400 240GB uses Phison, but the 480GB version uses SMI. Manufacturers can change SSD controllers at any time. You should check the controller in your SSD as soon as you get it. Instructions are below. Be sure your store has a return policy just in case. Do not buy any 480 or 240 gigabyte models. While they technically will work, since the drive size cannot be larger than the security sector, you will be limited to 250 gigabytes and 120 gigabytes respectively. And if anybody thinks that's not as bad, that means that you're going to have, if you have a 480 gigabyte SSD, you're only going to be flashing it to 250. And if you have a 240 gigabyte SSD, you'll only be able to use 120. So this is not saying don't use it, but this is more just saying that you're going to be wasting your money and your storage. He also says don't buy anything larger than 512 gigabytes. You won't be able to use more than 500 gigabytes. And for anybody who might be thinking this is like some rigid type implementation that Eaton put in, No, it's not. Real quick, retail, not modified, not like if you have a RGH or JTAG system and you're saying, well, I can patch it, I can put a 16 terabyte drive in there. This is not that. This is for the retail kernel. This is for unmodified retail kernel systems, which rely on a security sector file. Security sector files have only been created by Microsoft on official drives, so only the official drive sizes are the ones that you can use. So if you have a system that has not been hard exploited, like it's not a RGH or JTAG, the only hard drive sizes that you can use are 20 gigabyte, 60 gigabyte, 120 gigabyte, 250 gigabyte, and 500 gigabyte. And those limitations and sizes are because those are the size of drives that Microsoft ended up officially releasing. So for example, this is never going to happen, but if tomorrow Microsoft for some reason announced and released a 2 terabyte Xbox 360 hard drive or Xbox 360 SSD, we could dump the security sector from there and then we can flash up to 2 terabyte drives. In terms of future SSD controller compatibility, he's talking about other Phison controllers and says it's a very real possibility, so get in touch if you have one. Silicon Motion says that there's been some initial success, but not enough to make it SSD 360 compatible. Research is ongoing. Samsung is currently impossible. Sandforce is currently impossible. Marvel is unlikely to be supported. Maxio and Realtek they're investigating, and for others he's just saying to go ahead and comment. So in terms of checking your SSD, you can open up the SSD and look for the physical controller here. This one here on the left is a Phison controller that ends up being reliable. This one here, he's saying this is a SMI controller, which might be compatible in the future. But most people aren't going to want to open up their SSDs, which I totally understand. This one here, actually, I just noticed on this, you could see in the photo, there's like a little bit of damage here. So they probably didn't have, whoever took this photo, probably didn't have the best experience trying to rip this thing open. However, if you're wanting to check this only in software, there's a couple ways you can do it. You can use Crystal Disk Info to check the firmware version. And it says if it looks something like this, it doesn't need to match the exact picture, then it's a Phison. And we're going to be looking at the firmware, and this is SBFM 61.5. So unfortunately, it doesn't say directly there like P11, or I guess actually no, it's not that, it's S11, my apologies. So it doesn't say in there directly like S11, so that's a little bit frustrating there. But if you want to do a SMI check, they say that you can still use that same application, but you have to go into the edit menu, and then essentially you need to copy out some sensitive information on the SSD itself and put it into Notepad, and you should be able to see what the controller is right here. So this one, for example, states that the controller is a SMI 2259XT, which if we go up here, that is Silicon Motion, and they state there's been some initial success, but not quite enough to make it SSD 360 compatible. Research is ongoing. So meaning you cannot use this drive at this point, and you might be able to in the future, but you might just want to look for a compatible one. Some of the last things though is that we are stuck on that 500 gigabyte limitation. Like I talked about, the only way to bypass that is either to hard mod your system, or if Microsoft releases bigger hard drives for the Xbox 360. Those are the only two ways to bypass that. And in terms of the form factor here for like M2, they state here if you put this inside of an enclosure, it may work on the Xbox 360 only as long as it uses a supported controller. But do keep in mind that NVMe is not supported, but not all M2 drives are NVMe. So if you get a M2 SATA SSD and it has a compatible controller and you can adapt it, there's a chance that it could work even though it hasn't been tested. But if you try an NVMe drive, it's not going to work. If you try a SATA M.2 SSD and it has an incompatible controller, it's not going to work. And lastly, right here, well, there's no comments on it, but he is saying that if you have an SSD, try the above two checks to see if the controller is a Phison or SMI, and then put a picture of the SSD if it is. And if it's already in the list, then it'll be good to have an idea of which products will reliably come with the desired controllers. So I will tell you all this here, I end up getting one of these SSDs just to kind of prepare for this. I end up getting the inland one just because I've had pretty good experience with this particular drive, but do keep in mind the internals can always change at any point. So he does have the compatible drives here. I'm probably going to have them listed down below in the description as well too. And you know, if it's expanded upon, I certainly don't mind adding more models on there. But right now at this moment, we cannot do this, but this is really big based on what we had seen before on a ModChat episode a few months ago, I believe, where it was shown that this is possible, but really only with certain expensive hardware and software. Now, this has been a longer episode than I expected, and there was only a few topics that we were covering here, but still, it's been a long but good episode. But I do want to cover something that I usually find interesting, cool, funny, tangentially related to modding, what have you on here, and I found this to be pretty interesting, and while giving credit where credit is due, it looks like Giannis4224 over on Twitter ended up finding, well, credits, a hidden credit screen actually. They end up stating here, hidden credit screen on Majora's Mask GameCube. This is in the vanilla game. And you can see right here that they have the Dolphin emulator opened up. Presumably, of course, here, unless anything is being tampered with, this is playing Majora's Mask on here. And they state the credits. You can see credits engineering, and there are 6 teams right here. So this has to be the folks who ended up working on the emulator. They do state that you have to do a button combination to show this, and here's the details to reproduce it. I shared it everywhere. I need to chill, but I can't because I'm too excited by this discovery. So if we check this out over on the paste bin, you could see right here on Majora's Mask from the Collector's Edition, press the following buttons while holding L, R, and Z. So you have to do D-pad up, up, down, down, left, right, X, Y, B, A, up, left, down, right, A, and start. So I guess to me, it's a little bit nostalgic being able to unearth something like this, and really cool find on their part as well too, just because credits in games were not always a thing. So what would happen is way back in the day, you had to have, if developers end up putting credits in games, typically they would have to hide them using something like this. And Majora's Mask does have credits, but this here is specifically credits for the GameCube emulator of Majora's Mask that it is running on. So credit where credit is due, I can't complain on that. Anyways, that is about it for this episode of ModChat. Hopefully you all enjoyed it. Hopefully you all got to learn something, be entertained, what have you on there. And typically if you make it to the end of this episode, I like to pick a keyword or a key phrase, which will be used in a comment on the video upload here if you want to signify and show that you made it to the end of this episode. I typically pick something off of my desk, so how about sticker? Let's go with that. Are you a sticker collector? Do you like the Apple sticker that comes with a brand new iDevice or an iPhone when you get one? Do you put stickers all over the place? Are you annoyed when you have to take stickers off of cases, and especially discs like cartridges and all that as well too? Oh my, I got a little bit of trauma there. But either way, let's use the word sticker as our keyword. If you use that word in a comment on the video upload, I'll know that you made it to the end of this episode. Either way, that is about it for this episode of ModChat. If you enjoyed it, a like would absolutely be appreciated. And if you didn't like it, a dislike is fine as well too. As I always say, this is Mr. Mario, signing off. Thank you all for listening and watching, everyone. And until next time.